70 years ago today, the world witnessed a landmark Supreme Court decision that changed the path of public education. In the milestone Brown versus Board of Education civil rights case, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separating children in public schools on the basis of race was unconstitutional and inherently unequal. The suit combined several cases in which black students and their schools had far fewer resources than their white peers, which included longer commutes, lower quality classes, overcrowding, fewer opportunities, and less money. Yesterday, President Biden commemorated the anniversary by meeting with plaintiffs and family members at the White House, while also stepping up efforts to highlight his administration's commitment to racial equity.
Doris, much to celebrate about this date. It's also a reminder, though, and it's something that you write about in your book, the battles, the civil rights battles that raged throughout the 60s and the fight for justice. You know, it reminds us that today when we hear people saying, oh, this is the worst it's ever been. Oh, really? No, this is a reminder how much has changed in 70 years and how bad things were for Black Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for, quote, the others.
No, I think back to the 1960s, and the great thing about the civil rights movement was that it changed public sentiment. I mean, when marches were happening, when sit-ins happens, when freedom rides happens, the majority of people in the country came to the deep understanding that segregation was wrong. And the Civil Rights Act of '64, they came to the realization that all the diversions that were taking away the right to vote in the South was wrong. And that voting rights bill was approved by the majority of the country. There was a minor chord, there was a backlash, and now that minor chord is so much larger than it was then. I mean, think about that Supreme Court decision on Brown v. Board. It was unanimous.
Right.
Chief Justice Warren knew that there were people who didn't want to overturn precedent from Plessy v. Ferguson, but he knew it was important for the country, for the institution, so that Congress worked in the 60s, the Supreme Court worked in the 60s, and you look at what we've just been watching, a Congress that we can't even imagine young people wanting to join. Right. It's heartbreaking because politics was an honorable vocation back then. People wanted to be in government. Yeah. I just want to go back and live in that time, as troubling as it was.
You know, Rev, after I got out of Congress, people would say, oh, I bet you're glad you're out of Congress. And I said, no, I loved it. I loved every minute of being able to make a difference in people's lives. And what surprised me is I went up as, you know, a hard-charging, small government ideologue who wanted to balance budgets. When I left, the thing that I looked back on and the thing those things that remain, not the balanced budgets, obviously, people would walk up to me and said, you helped me, you know, you helped my grandparents. They were about to lose their farm.
Services.
It was basic constituent services. And it is, Bobby Kennedy said that politics was an honorable profession. It was, and it should be.
And it defines who you are, not what you possessed, not the title you had, but what you did with it that helped other people. And I think as I was listening to Doris, what a lot of people today don't remember or understand or have studied if they weren't alive, Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice then, was a Republican.
Right.
And we saw a Republican in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower. So it was not that Republicans and Democrats had this acrimony around race and other things in the 50s and 60s like we see now. When a Republican can sit there and do, this was the first Supreme Court decision we'd seen since the ending of Reconstruction that gave blacks some equal rights. So this wasn't like this was one of many cases. This was the landmark case, 54, landmark case, 55, Rosa Parks sits in, and we go all the way to 64, 65, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. But it started with Thurgood Marshall, a black attorney, educated at Howard University, later becomes on the Supreme Court, argues before a Republican Supreme Court with Earl Warren, and is able to break segregation. It's a real day that we need to get all of the implications of.
And Doris, what happened in 64 and 65, you know, I think we all appreciated it less when it seemed like that arc of justice was, or that arc of history was bending toward justice, now that we're running into so many roadblocks, you look back and go, my God, what was accomplished in 64 and 65 is breathtaking. And you write about it in your book.
And it happened because tens of thousands of young people were willing to sit in, be in the freedom rides, march against segregation, put themselves on the line, be hospitalized, be sent to jail, and fight for something. And then that movement then reaches the highest councils of power, where Lyndon Johnson sat at that time. Lucky we were that he came in making civil rights the first priority. And then he said, we owe it to them. But he had the power then to help make the Congress make those decisions. And that's when change takes place, when the outside movement creates public sentiment. And it also happened that because the reaction to what the marchers were doing peacefully was so terrible, both in Birmingham and in Selma, that the conscience of the country was fired. And everybody in the country knew something was wrong, and they wanted to do something about it.
I was going to say, Rev, it's a great example of how extraordinary things can come out of tragedy.
Exactly.
You look at the harsh reaction to the Freedom Riders, and of course, the Birmingham church bombing. It shocked Americans out of their slumber, and it moved history. It bent history.
Well, that is something you and I talk about often, is you can't get in the way of your own message. What they had the discipline to do, which Doris is saying correctly, they suffered to show the point that they were raising, rather than they be belligerent or violent and get in the way of their own point. You can have the right point and do it the wrong way and get in the way of your own message. The fact that John Lewis and the Freedom Riders and others allowed themselves to be beaten, the fact that Hosea Williams and James Bevel got Dr. King to allow them to put school children on the streets in Birmingham, and people saw the dogs coming to bite, that's what changed the element. Had they came in and beat the dogs, we may have never got a Civil Rights Act. And I think the sacrifice they did, you have to be great enough to do great things in the face of ugliness if you really believe in what you do.